Alright, let's hit it. 3 watercolor mistakes that's wasting your time and my tips to help you guys out. So before we get into that, the 3 main colors I'm going to be using are Naples Yellow, Magenta, and Indigo. So I think all things considered, watercolor is a pretty simple medium. You know, you're just sort of balancing the water with the amount of pigment, you know, water on the brush versus water on the page. So my first tip would be, especially when you're working wet and wet, you really want to control the amount of water on the page. And when I say that, I mean you don't want the paper to be so wet that it's full of puddles, because any inconsistencies in the amount of water in an area is going to cause it to dry differently, and you're going to kind of not get the smooth gradient that you might be going for with wet and wet. The goal is to have a good even distribution of like moisture across the page, rather than more in some areas and less in others, unless that's your specific goal, because you're only working on that particular area. And another sort of little sub tip could be the climate sort of your house, you know, like the amount of humidity in the air, how hot it is in the house, can sort of pull water out of the page a little bit faster than you might want it to, or a little bit slower than you might want it to. So sometimes if you find your paper's drying too quickly, it kind of helps to wet the page multiple times. To wet the paper, let the water soak in, and then wet it a second time. And you can see here I'm actually putting a layer of water over the paint to get my second layer down, because the paper's drying out so quickly in my house. And all that I'm painting here is another idea for beginners. It's just a simple night sky with some stars in it and a little silhouetted landscape at the bottom. When I first picked up watercolors, I really had no idea how to manage the water being on the page. Because, you know, I knew that there was wet on wet. I'd heard of that before. I'd heard of sort of wet on dry also. But I never really put 2 and 2 together and figured out that you really need the paper to be sort of evenly wet, you know, or evenly dry even, before you start putting your colors down. Otherwise, your gradients are going to be a little bit off. Or if you're not working towards a gradient, then when you're trying to get those crisp edges with the wet on dry method, then your work's going to kind of be bleeding all around. So to move on to the next tip, I think now's a good time to go into it. You see the size of the brush that I'm using? I think the next good tip would be brush sizes. When you're sort of doing washes like these, you're going to want to use a larger brush than when you're starting to paint in details wet on dry. You know, I think one thing that beginners sort of do wrong often is they're trying to use a small brush to do this, or they're going into their details with a big brush like this. You know, for a sheet of paper this size, you really want to be using a smaller brush, kind of like what you see me using here, when you go into some of the areas that you need a little bit more control. So I don't really think you can really use one brush for your entire painting, depending on what you're painting, of course. It really helps if you have at least one brush for your details that's fine and has a good edge to it. And if you've got another brush that's a lot larger for your washes, or for anywhere that's a larger area of color. And the mixture of paint that I'm using to paint in the ground silhouetted in is that same indigo blue with the magenta. but I added in some sepia because I wanted to paint in a dark color that wasn't just black straight out of the tube. I wanted it to have some warmth to it and kind of match the colors that are around it. And as I'm working my way higher up this tree on the left side, I'm trying to incorporate a little bit more cool colors, you know, a little bit more of that indigo into it so that it is sort of getting cooler as it moves up, because that's what the gradation above it is doing. And one bonus tip is when you're painting in trees or foliage or anything that's got these random shapes to it, like maybe rocks on a riverbed, it helps if you kind of just dab the brush onto the page around a little bit, because that helps you kind of figure out the shape without having to just draw straight lines or curved lines. You can see me there as I'm figuring out the branches or the bunches of leaves off the branches here. I'm just dabbing the brush a little bit, and you can connect those shapes into whatever you need them to be after. So you can just see me dabbing the brush here on this blue color for these leaves up top. And when it comes to color, my third tip would be, especially starting out as a beginner in watercolor, it's very useful to not use too many colors in your painting. It's good to limit your palette, with the palette meaning the amount of paints that you're using in the painting. Try to drop the number of colors down as low as you can. That's gonna help you focus in on other things like composition, value, some of the shapes that you're putting down. By simplifying the colors, you also help to unite the entire painting. The colors help your eyes to move across the page and almost forms its own color composition independent of the shapes even. So that would be my third tip. Go ahead and use less colors. Try to see if you might even be able to use just 2 colors or just 3 instead of anything more than that. Simplify things down, you make your statement more clear. And here's a fun part. I'm using that Winsor & Newton's designer gouache, and this is some kind of white color. You can put that right onto your brush, right onto your toothbrush actually, and you can see this is a little bit messy of a process, but you can sort of spray it right down onto the page and get these nice splatters that are really useful for any kind of like particles that you might have in your painting. Here I'm using it for stars in the sky. This is definitely one of those unique things to watercolor that's super fun, just being able to just spray the paint down like that. And this is the painting. The last step is to pull the tape off and check it out. So guys, I really do think that if you follow those 3 tips at whatever level you're at, try simplifying things down, simplify the colors that you're using. Use brushes that are more appropriate to the part of the painting that you're trying to work on, and control the amount of water that you're using so that you could get the type of edges that you're going for. If you want them kind of blending and smooth, if you want them hard and crispy, let the water help you. Let the water take you there. those are my big 3 tips. You know, I don't want you guys sort of wasting your time like I did when I first picked up watercolors. And these are just some of those common mistakes that I think will help you out a lot. Since we're on the topic of watercolor ideas, check out this painting idea here. It has a lot of those tips of keeping things simple and using the right brush for the job. Or if you want something that's a little bit more complex, check out this portrait mixed media painting technique here.